They said the message was never meant to be seen, folded into the lining of a diplomat's coat, passed in silence beneath the noise of a Vienna cafe. It traveled halfway across the world before anyone even realized it had vanished. A single scrap of paper, 10 names, and a date no one was supposed to survive. Tonight, we step into that silence. Welcome. If this kind of story finds you, the quiet kind, the dark kind, the kind that slips through history like smoke under a locked door, you're exactly where you're meant to be. If you enjoy true stories that feel like spy novels, whispered betrayals, and shadows that stretch for decades, you might want to like and subscribe, but only if that's your thing. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Type it in the comments. I want to know who's out there, in the quiet, listening with me. Now, take a breath, dim the lights, get comfortable. Because what we're about to explore isn't in your history books. It's what history buried. A betrayal that unraveled alliances, a man who vanished behind a different name, and a decision that nearly ignited the Cold War years before anyone dared speak its name. This is not just a story, it's a warning. He stepped into the hallway like a man fleeing a dream. The corridor behind him was still, silent, and dressed in the sterile gray of Soviet concrete. No footsteps, no alarms, but the silence pressed harder than a siren. Igor Gouzenko clutched the leather briefcase close to his chest, heart thudding like a fist inside his ribs. It wasn't heavy with anything the eye could see, but it was full of secrets that could bring down governments. Documents he'd stolen from his own desk, typed with his own hands, secrets about spies in London, Ottawa, even Washington, names, locations, orders, code names like Uranus and MOT whispered across the Atlantic to KGB handlers with icy patience. In his mind, every sound now carried weight. The quiet click of a light switch behind a door, the squeak of his worn shoes on the marble floor, the slow moan of wind outside the tall windows of the Soviet embassy in Ottawa. He was still inside enemy lines, only now, for the first time, his own side was the enemy. He didn't look back. His fingers trembled as they closed the stairwell door behind him. No elevator. Elevators could trap you. He took the steps 2 at a time, heart hammering with the rhythm of war drums, blood singing with adrenaline. Each floor passed like a layer of armor falling away. Second floor, then the first, then the iron clack of the front door. A gust of Canadian autumn wind smacked his face, and for a second, he froze, blinded by moonlight, disoriented by the sudden vastness of the world outside. Ottawa's streets were nearly empty. The city had gone quiet with wartime fatigue. It was late, and even the drunks had given up and staggered home. The embassy gate lay 20 meters ahead, and something moved in the shadows to the left. He turned sharply, heart seized, but it was only a branch, shaking in the wind. Or was it? A trick of light, perhaps, or a pair of eyes watching through a curtain. He couldn't tell. It didn't matter. He pulled his hat low over his brow and crossed the courtyard quickly, praying the night guard hadn't been rotated early, praying the locks hadn't been changed in the last hour. He pressed his shoulder to the side gate. It creaked, metallic and deliberate, and the sound made him flinch. The embassy behind him stood still, its windows dark, yet every inch of his body screamed to run. He didn't. Not yet. He closed the gate with trembling hands, walking fast, but not too fast, not fast enough to draw attention, not slow enough to be followed. Down the narrow street, then left, then right, then another left, like he'd rehearsed. 7 turns, no patterns, no tails. The briefcase knocked against his hip, full of names that could destroy men, full of cables that would ignite a war. He didn't know if anyone had seen him, but he knew someone would. Svetlana sat in the dark, with the baby pressed to her chest, counting every passing second with the cadence of prayer. 1003, 1004, 1005. Still no knock at the door. She stared into the blackness of their tiny apartment, if you could call it that. 3 bare rooms in a Soviet-owned complex just off Somerset Street. Her ears strained for sirens, for knocks, for boots, for footsteps. Her husband had left 27 minutes ago. 27 minutes since he had walked out with the documents. And now there was only silence. The child stirred, whimpering in his sleep. She hushed him with a kiss to the temple. Her eyes flicked again toward the window to the shadows across the street. Had that curtain moved? She thought she saw someone standing still under the lamplight, or was it just her reflection? She pressed her hand to her stomach and reminded herself to breathe. Igor had promised to go straight to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, to explain everything, to warn them, to save them, she corrected herself. Not Canada, not the West, just their little family. 2 Russians, 1 baby, and a truth no one wanted to hear. But truth made you dangerous. And in Russia, dangerous men disappeared. Gouzenko made his way toward the RCMP headquarters, cutting through side streets and service lanes, avoiding the main roads. He thought about all the messages he'd typed over the last 2 years. Messages filled with coded betrayals and quiet acts of war. Instructions to steal uranium data, to infiltrate military labs, to recruit agents within the Canadian Civil Service. The Soviet plan had been careful, methodical, hidden in plain sight, and he'd been part of it. Every click of his typewriter had pushed the enemy line deeper into the heart of the West. He had read the lies, typed them, sealed them, and now he was trying to undo them. The lights of the RCMP station came into view like a distant fire. Warm, distant, hopeful. He picked up his pace. But the front desk sergeant was unimpressed. A defection? The man repeated flatly, blinking at him as though he were asking to borrow a bicycle. At this hour? I have documents, Gouzenko hissed, eyes darting. Names, there are spies in your government, active ones. Sir, I think you've had too much to drink. Go home and come back during office hours. I can't, he said, louder than he meant to. They'll kill me, my wife, my child. They know I'm gone. The sergeant leaned forward. I'm going to ask you to leave the premises now. Gouzenko's heart dropped. He was dismissed, not believed, not even understood. And he knew in that moment, coldly and absolutely, that he was on his own. He left without another word, the briefcase heavy with all the truth no one wanted to carry. He tried the Department of Justice next. Closed, then Parliament Hill. Empty. No one. The guards waved him off. Come back in the morning. The morning, if he made it that long. He walked home slowly, shoulders sinking, the cold air pressing into his lungs like blades. It was nearly 3:00 a.m. when he turned onto Somerset again. A black car passed him, slow, deliberate. Soviet plates. He stepped into an alley and waited. They didn't stop, but they knew. God, they knew. He ran the last 3 blocks to the apartment. When Svetlana opened the door, he collapsed inside, shaking. He dropped the briefcase and fell to his knees. They didn't believe me, he said, barely audible. No one would help. She held him in silence as the baby cried. The world outside continued turning. But now they were fugitives. They would never go back. The next night, Gouzenko tried something desperate. He knocked on the neighbor's door. Mr. and Mrs. Brown lived next to them, quiet Anglicans who taught piano and owned a cat named Horace. They were kind, curious, occasionally frightened by the strange Russian couple with hollow eyes and quiet dinners. But tonight, Gouzenko didn't have the luxury of diplomacy. He knocked once, then twice, then frantically, the door cracked open. I need help, he whispered. They'll come for us, tonight. The Browns stared, confused. I have documents, secret Soviet files. They're going to kill us. You must call the police. Mrs. Brown frowned. Is this a joke? No, please, you have to. The door closed in his face. Back in his own flat, Gouzenko stood at the window and watched the streetlights flicker. Somewhere out there, the men he used to work for were watching, waiting, planning. He pressed his forehead to the glass and whispered to no one, Will anyone believe me before it's too late?" The baby cried again, and somewhere beneath them, a car engine growled to life. The night wasn't over, not even close. The first time he ever touched the cable was on a Tuesday morning, not long after the snows had receded and Ottawa smelled faintly of thawing pine and diesel. Igor Gouzenko, 26 years old and already worn thin by war, quietly unlatched the safe in the communications room of the Soviet embassy. It was the kind of morning that looked harmless, almost gentle. Sunlight in the window, the soft scrape of diplomatic typewriters clicking from the floor above, but the envelope he held in his hands vibrated with something heavier than language. It was marked Striktno Sekretno, top secret. 2 red stamps bled across the thick paper like veins. He didn't know it yet, but this piece of paper, typed with careful spacing and cloaked in layered codes, would be the first seed of doubt that would eventually bloom into betrayal. At the time, he told himself he was only doing his job. He had been sent to Canada as a cipher clerk in 1943, just as the tides of war were beginning to shift. Moscow needed eyes everywhere, and embassies in quiet Allied cities like Ottawa were perfect staging grounds. Officially, he was part of the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Service. Unofficially, he was part of a quiet war nobody would admit was happening. He decoded cables sent from Moscow, translated messages into precise encryption, and ensured they reached the right hands. Resident agents embedded in universities, in parliamentary offices, and most crucially, in the direction of atomic research. Canada, after all, was part of the secret Allied uranium project, the one the Americans called the Manhattan Engineer District, the one that had just turned Hiroshima into ash. Gouzenko's workroom was small, windowless, a gray cube humming with the quiet death rattle of a ventilation fan. The cipher books were thick, leather-bound and numbered, containing endless pages of randomly generated digits to match Soviet transpositions. He would sit for hours, translating strings of seemingly meaningless characters into orders, agent reports, technical requests, field acknowledgments. He was methodical, efficient, and for a long time, he didn't let himself read between the lines. But one evening a name caught his eye, something buried in the stream of symbols that sounded vaguely English. Laskin. Then elsewhere, Montreal. He blinked, reread the sequence, then checked the outgoing cable. The line was clear. Moscow had authorized the use of new sources in Canada's atomic research sector. The request came with instructions for follow-up via coded drop and a demand for blueprints regarding the American uranium separation process. He stared at the page, unsure if he had mistranslated. It was not uncommon for the Soviet Union to request scientific intelligence from its diplomatic outposts. But uranium? Manhattan? Those were red lines, even for a system that had no lines at all. He filed the cable in silence and went home late that night. Svetlana had left a pot of cabbage stew on the stove. The smell filled the small apartment like a question he didn't want to answer. She was feeding the baby, her movements slow and tired, her hands red from washing clothes by hand in the embassy basement. He kissed her cheek. Her skin was warm, and the child reached for his collar. He smiled, reflexively, the way tired men do when they don't want to speak the truth aloud. She asked if the embassy was busy. He said yes. She asked if he thought they'd go home to Moscow soon. He lied and said probably, but the truth sat in the back of his mind like a knife buried under snow. Moscow wasn't sending its best to Ottawa for goodwill. It was sending its quietest, its invisible. Canada, by all appearances, was a sleepy, frostbitten corner of the Allied world, but it was also where Anglo-American atomic secrets occasionally converged, where scientists from Britain and America discussed the theoretical backbone of nuclear fusion. The Soviets had always known this. They were patient. He began to pay attention differently after that. Every cable was no longer just a line of numbers. They were maps, names, patterns. He kept a journal, carefully coded, disguised in the back of an engineering manual, where he jotted phrases and timings. He saw a name repeated 3 times in as many weeks. Alan Nunn May. He was a British physicist who'd briefly passed through Canada, and suddenly he was the subject of multiple encrypted references and confirmed handoffs. That was the moment when the veil started to fall. The Soviet Union was not simply watching, it was stealing. And worse, the agents doing it weren't just shadows in fedoras. Some were professors, some were clerks, some were born in the very countries they now betrayed. The war had ended, yes, but another kind of war had already begun. He thought of Stalin's face on the wall above his desk. The portrait stared down, unmoving, eternal, as though judging his every keystroke. He had believed in the motherland once, believed in her victory over fascism, her strength, her ideology. But that belief had dulled when he saw what happened to neighbors who whispered too loudly. When he watched young men disappear into labor camps for reading the wrong books. When his own mother, frail and half-blind, had to bribe her way into bread during the worst days of the siege. The war had crushed much of the world, but it had revealed the core of his country. And it was not glory. It was fear. Svetlana had her own doubts, though she rarely voiced them. They both knew the risks of talking openly. But some nights, when the city was quiet and the child had fallen asleep, they would lie side by side on their thin mattress and speak in whispers. She asked once, "Would we stay here if we could?" He didn't answer. She asked again, "If Moscow told us to go back tomorrow, would you take us?" He hesitated. Then he told her the truth. No. They stopped talking for a while after that, but it was not a silence of distance. It was an agreement. Their life in Ottawa was small but unthreatening. There were trees in the park near the canal. There were markets. There were Canadians who smiled, even at strangers. It was, for all its flaws, a place where people did not disappear for asking the wrong question. Gouzenko began to want that for his son. More than that, he began to feel ashamed that he had ever accepted less. The cables continued. He translated a request for details on British radars, then on American storage depots. The requests weren't vague anymore. They were sharpened, precise, surgical. The network was expanding, and then one afternoon the document arrived that changed everything. It was from Moscow, direct. The cable was heavily encrypted and arrived with an urgent stamp. It referenced Objective 12C and instructed the Canadian resident agent to secure full identity verification of agents with primary access to the Anglo-American nuclear program. The message included code names, no real names, but Gouzenko had seen these codes before, in fragmentary reports, always under the context of atomic access. There were 13 code names. He decoded each, carefully, methodically, trying not to shake. It took 2 hours. When he finished, he cross-referenced them with earlier cables. He scribbled furiously in the margins of his notebook, matching date stamps and message IDs. When he was done, he knew. There wasn't just a Soviet spy in Canada's scientific labs. There were dozens, and some of them, perhaps many, were operating in the US and Britain too. The Soviets weren't hoping to discover nuclear secrets. They were already taking them, patiently, piece by piece, atom by atom. He sat back in his chair, heart racing. If the West didn't already suspect, it would soon be too late. The atomic monopoly wouldn't last. Moscow would build its own bomb. He had read enough in the side margins of the cables to know the timeline. They were years ahead of where anyone suspected. The cables were like veins, pumping intelligence through a body the world didn't even know was sick. And he was the clerk decoding the heartbeat. He went home that night and didn't speak. Svetlana noticed. He stared at his child sleeping in the crib. The next morning, he took the first 2 documents home, carefully folded into the inside pocket of his coat. He hid them under the mattress. The guilt of it made him ill, but he couldn't stop. He kept working, but each week he took another fragment, a cable, a codebook page, a delivery schedule. He knew where to look. He was invisible. No one suspects the typist. No one watches the man they're used to ignoring. But every page he smuggled made the noose tighten. One evening, he saw a senior officer glance twice at his briefcase. The next day, a replacement cipher clerk arrived, on temporary assignment. That night, he told Svetlana everything. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply asked, "When?" He said soon. She began stitching a lining into their child's coat. And when he lay down that night, he no longer feared being caught. He feared not being caught, because now he knew too much. And there was no going back. It was just before dusk when the door creaked, a sound so ordinary it could have passed unnoticed. But that night it slammed through the silence of the embassy corridor like a verdict. Igor Gouzenko froze mid-sentence, pen hovering above a copied cipher fragment. His ears strained, breath held as soft footsteps approached, paused, and then faded back down the hall. He didn't dare move until the faint, metallic click of a closing latch confirmed that whoever had passed wasn't staying. Then, slowly, he resumed writing, his hand trembling only slightly now, his mind calculating how many more nights like this he could survive before he either made the jump or they closed the net. Each evening had become a form of surgery, precise, silent, deadly if rushed. The embassy's concrete walls no longer felt like protection from the outside world. They were pressure chambers, airless and alert, where smiles were weapons and glances lingered just too long. The longer he stayed, the more eyes seemed to follow him, some invisible, some not. And even when he was alone in the cipher room, surrounded only by typewriters, safes, and cables, he felt as if the walls themselves had begun to memorize him, watching for patterns, for slip-ups. He had begun to hide the documents in pieces, never too many at once. Some were folded flat and pressed into the hollow under a floorboard in their apartment. Others were slipped into the child's toy box, where Svetlana had sewn a false bottom with trembling fingers and thread she'd scrounged from embassy mending kits. The most damning ones, the blueprint requests, the decoded spy ring summaries, and the agent activation schedules, he kept in the lining of his own coat. If caught, there would be no way to explain them away. He would vanish, quietly and forever. Maybe Svetlana too, almost certainly the child. The Soviets did not forgive traitors. They erased them. And yet, the most unbearable part wasn't fear. It was the silence. He could tell no one. There was no friend he trusted, no whisper he could risk. The West, to him, was still a mystery. Its agencies opaque, its motivations unclear. He didn't even know if they'd take him seriously. And if they didn't, what then? Turned away, exposed, hunted? The embassy had its watchers, both official and unofficial. There was the man they all called Misha, who never asked questions but always arrived early, always left late. There was the janitor with the limp who seemed to hover just a little too long when cleaning near the cipher rooms. And worst of all, there was Colonel Nikolai Shevchenko, nominally a diplomat, in practice the GRU's iron hand in Ottawa. He had eyes like cold iron and a voice that never rose above a whisper but still froze the blood. A week ago, Shevchenko had paused by Gouzenko's desk and asked, casually, if he believed loyalty should be proven or assumed, then walked away without waiting for an answer. Every day since then, Gouzenko had woken up certain it would be the day they came for him. Svetlana bore it silently. She had grown thin. Her eyes were no longer filled with worry. They were taut with something else, something harder. Resolve. Their child was still too young to understand, still playing with blocks on the carpet, still babbling about ducks and snow and the color blue. Gouzenko would sit beside him sometimes, hand on his tiny shoulder, heart splitting in two at the thought that this fragile, innocent life could be extinguished with a single administrative order. He worked faster. He began using his knowledge of the GRU's cipher systems to prioritize what he took. He knew which codebooks were recycled and which ones were unique. He knew the routing numbers that referred to direct transmissions from Moscow's center. He could spot the differences between diplomatic filler and core intelligence. Each night, he made his selections like a surgeon, choosing where to make the incision. Some documents contained confirmation of agents placed inside Canada's atomic research programs, an exact name, a drop location, a list of requested materials. Others included instructions to track Allied troop repositionings in Europe. There were even directives about infiltrating post-war reconstruction committees, long-view planning, a slow conquest of institutions from within. Not the sharp spike of sabotage, but the slow rot of infiltration. He had never realized how vast the machinery was until he began disassembling it by hand. Then came the night he knew he was almost out of time. It started with a silence that felt wrong. The embassy was usually quiet after 9 p.m., but this was different. He sat in the cipher room, flicking through a folder that detailed new courier schedules for agents embedded in scientific roles. But instead of background chatter, distant phones, footsteps, the occasional closing drawer, there was nothing. Absolute stillness. And then the sound, 3 slow, deliberate taps on the doorframe. He turned, carefully. Colonel Shevchenko stood there, hands clasped behind his back, eyes unreadable. "Late again, Comrade Gouzenko," he said, voice flat. Such dedication. "I have backlog," Gouzenko replied, smiling, forcing his voice into something resembling casual. "Moscow keeps us busy." Shevchenko nodded slowly. His eyes drifted to the folder on the desk, the open codebook beside it. Then, after an eternal pause, he said, "Make sure everything is in order. Accuracy is important." Then he walked away. Gouzenko didn't move for a full minute after the door closed. His pulse was hammering in his throat. He looked down at the cable he had just unfolded. It was one he hadn't seen before, an update to agent objectives marked urgent. It confirmed an expanded list of Soviet spies within Allied nations, including updated priorities, uranium extraction, sabotage preparedness, and access to U.S. military infrastructure. It was the document. The one that, if brought to the right people, couldn't be ignored or misunderstood. He knew what he had to do. He placed it carefully under the lining in his sleeve, where a narrow slit had already been cut. He folded the cable with practiced precision, tucked it into place, then stood, arms stiff at his side, afraid to breathe. For 5 long minutes, he remained in that room, listening for any sound that might suggest he'd been seen. There was none. He walked out with the paper on his person. That night, when he got home, he said nothing until the child was asleep. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and told Svetlana everything. That he had stolen the last document, that it was the one, that they would either be free or dead. She looked at him with a stare that bore no trace of fear, only exhaustion and a kind of quiet love that hurt more than anything else. She said, "Then we go." "Are you sure?" he asked, voice cracking. "If they catch us, they won't. You don't know that." She touched his hand gently. "But I know you, and I trust that." He wept, not out of relief, but because he understood the cost she had just accepted without protest. Later that night, they sat together and practiced what to say. If approached, if interrogated, if separated. He taught her how to burn a document in seconds using their stove, where to hide the rest. He showed her the exact pages he had smuggled, explained why they mattered. They made no plans beyond 1 day ahead. Anything else was fantasy. The next morning, he returned to the embassy as usual, coat pressed, face blank. But his heart pounded like a drum in a funeral procession. He nodded to colleagues, sat at his desk, typed meaningless logs. All the while, the final cable itched against his skin like a brand. At 4:52 p.m., just as he was preparing to leave, he heard a knock. Not on the door this time, on the window beside his desk. He turned and saw Misha, the watcher, standing outside, eyes locked on him through the glass. No expression, no words, just a nod. Gouzenko smiled weakly, then turned back to his files. He didn't go home immediately. He took a detour, bought bread, walked slowly, inconspicuously. He doubled back once, checking for a tail. There was none, but the air felt heavy, like thunder before a storm. He reached home just as the sky turned a deep, bruised gray. Svetlana had already packed the child's bag. She said nothing, just handed him the coat. He held her for a long time. Then he knelt beside their son's crib, kissed his forehead, and whispered a promise. A promise that no matter what happened next, this was for him. That he would grow up somewhere with light, with choice, with no portraits of Stalin watching from the walls. Then he stood and stepped into history. One wrong move and he'd be caught. But that night, he moved like a man who had already died, because only men who faced their end walk so quietly toward their beginning. The cold air burned against his skin as he stepped into the night. The weight of the documents pressed flat and hot against his chest despite the chill. The streets were too quiet, the lamps flickering too softly, the snow muffling every footstep like a conspirator. Gouzenko didn't know where to go first, only that he couldn't return. Not to the embassy, not yet, maybe not ever. The embassy no longer meant service to the homeland. It meant arrest. It meant Shevchenko's eyes, Misha's knock, and a slow, suffocating disappearance into the basement of some nameless prison. He pulled his coat tighter and began walking, each step echoing like a question he couldn't answer. He headed toward the building across from his own, the flat where a man named R.C. Kelly lived. A neighbor, a quiet clerk. Civil service, perhaps. Gouzenko didn't know him well, but he'd nodded to him often enough on the stairs, seen the man carry groceries, heard the child's laughter through the walls. Kelly had a decent face, not cold. That was enough. He knocked, softly at first, then harder. The door opened a crack, the chain still on. Kelly's eyes blinked through the gap, surprise etched in them. "I need help," Gouzenko whispered, his Russian accent thick with panic. "Please, it's important, very important." Kelly hesitated. "I have documents," Gouzenko said, "about Soviet spies, in Canada, in America, real spies. I can prove it." The door remained chained. Gouzenko saw the man's eyes narrow, the calculation behind them. Then, "I think you need to talk to the authorities." I tried. A lie, but it came out with the truth's urgency. "They won't listen." A pause. Then Kelly's voice, clipped and apologetic. "I'm sorry, Mr. Gouzenko. I really think you should call someone else." The door closed. Gouzenko stood there for a moment, stunned. Then he turned, heart beating faster. He had imagined many reactions. Fear, skepticism, confusion, but rejection hadn't been one of them. Not like that. Not from a fellow civilian, one he'd lived next to for months. Was the man afraid? Or just not interested? Maybe he didn't believe him. Maybe he did. And that was worse. The sky above was still dark, the moon veiled in frost. Snow whispered underfoot as Gouzenko turned his collar against the wind and walked toward Spark Street. Somewhere public, somewhere alive. He passed shuttered cafes and lamplight halos, his mind spiraling around the growing sense that he was already too late, that they knew, that back at the embassy, they had found his desk drawer empty, his coat hook bare, that Shevchenko had picked up the phone with cold fingers and muttered orders into the line, orders that meant a car was now idling somewhere, its engine warm, its trunk waiting. He pushed on. Next came the Ottawa Journal, a modest office on a quiet stretch of street. Its windows were dark except for one glowing pane above the entrance. He knocked on the glass, then again louder. Eventually a man answered. He wore suspenders and a frown, sleeves rolled up, cigarette between two fingers. Gouzenko explained everything in one breathless rush: espionage, betrayal, nuclear secrets, names and numbers, the danger, the urgency, the proof, real proof. He began to unbutton his coat, reaching for the lining. The man held up a hand. Wait, slow down. Who did you say you were?" "Gouzenko, Igor Gouzenko, cipher clerk for the Soviet embassy." "And you're saying you're defecting?" "Yes, now, tonight." The man looked at him for a long moment, chewing the thought like something bitter. Then he said, "You're serious?" "I have the documents." Gouzenko reached again. But the man didn't look at the coat. He looked past him, toward the street, and said, "You realize how dangerous this is for us. We're not a government agency. If what you're saying is true, that's the kind of story that gets people killed. I need someone to listen. I need help. I'm not the one to give it." The door closed again, firmer this time, final. Gouzenko stood in the silence, breath steaming from his mouth, fingers numb. He looked down the street, empty, then back the way he'd come, just as empty. But it didn't feel empty. It felt watched. Every shadow seemed too still, every window too dark. He stepped off the curb and walked again, faster now. By the time he reached the Justice Building, the sky had begun to pale with false dawn. He approached the main entrance, but it was locked. A guard inside pointed him toward another door. That one was locked too. Another guard passed and asked if he had an appointment. Gouzenko tried to explain, but the man just shook his head. "Come back during business hours." "I may not be alive by then," Gouzenko whispered. The guard laughed nervously, thinking it a joke. Gouzenko said nothing, only turned and walked away, each footstep heavier than the last. His hope was unraveling, thread by thread. The city around him remained placid. The snow on the sidewalks remained undisturbed. There was no siren, no chase, no indication that anyone, friend or enemy, was doing anything. That was the most terrifying part. The absence, the stillness. Because somewhere behind that calm, wheels were turning. He made his way back toward home, not because it was safe, but because there was nowhere else to go. Svetlana opened the door before he knocked. Her eyes asked the question he couldn't answer. "Nothing," he said softly. "No one." She nodded, then turned away to finish boiling water for tea. That night, they sat in silence. The child slept soundly. Gouzenko stared at the wall, listening. The building made its usual noises, pipes clanking, stairs creaking, radiators hissing. But tonight, those noises took on new shapes in his mind. A footfall, a hand on a doorknob, the quiet click of a safety being released. They left the lights on. At midnight there was a sound. Not a knock, not exactly. More like a shift, a weight outside the apartment door, just heavy enough to be felt through the floor. Svetlana tensed. Gouzenko held up a hand, listened. A creak. Another, then silence. He moved toward the door, pressed his ear against it. Nothing. Not even breathing. Then a whisper of motion. Quick, sudden, gone. Like someone stepping away. He turned back to her, eyes wide. She nodded. They didn't sleep. They just waited. Outside, the city pretended nothing was happening. But inside, in a second-floor apartment of a modest building on Somerset Street, history held its breath, because the future of East and West had come down to a man with stolen papers, a woman with nothing left to lose, and a child too young to understand the weight of the silence surrounding them. And still, no one came. Not the police, not the press, not the government. They waited while the walls closed in. Was the KGB already there? Under the dim light of early morning, the air outside was still, almost too still, as if the world was collectively holding its breath, unaware that the Cold War had, in that moment, already begun. Inside the cramped apartment, Gouzenko stood by the window, breath fogging the glass, eyes scanning the street below with the relentless paranoia of a man convinced every shadow could swallow him. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from the jagged edge of uncertainty. How many minutes had passed since the last footstep echoed in the hallway? How long until someone knocked and didn't walk away? He knew now that there was no undoing it. The embassy would discover the missing documents. The KGB would move swiftly. The moment he stepped outside again, he was either stepping into a future of exile and protection, or into the muzzle of a silenced pistol. By the time he approached the RCMP's headquarters, the sun had begun to stretch a soft orange over Ottawa's rooftops, but there was nothing warm about the reception inside. A receptionist with a tired voice asked for his name. He didn't give it. He only held up the documents. She blinked. So he did it again, more urgently, pressing the folder across the counter with the air of someone passing a ticking bomb. They didn't understand what they were holding. The officer assigned to speak with him was polite, almost amused. He glanced over a few pages, but the Cyrillic and code strings meant nothing to him. He asked if Gouzenko had an appointment. Gouzenko replied quietly, "No. I have proof of spies, real ones, in your government." The officer raised a brow. Gouzenko tried again. "There is a Soviet operation. Spies, Canada, United States, Britain. Nuclear secrets." He tapped the folder. "Here, it's all here." Still, they looked at him as if he were a lunatic, perhaps worse, a liar. Ottawa had not yet trained its mind to think like Washington or Moscow. The war had only just ended. The word espionage still belonged in novels and old war stories. The Cold War had not been named, but Gouzenko knew. He knew it had already begun. He returned home disillusioned. Svetlana met him at the door, her face ghostly. She asked if they had believed him. He shook his head. He opened the curtains a sliver and watched the embassy across the street. The blinds there were still drawn, but they wouldn't stay that way for long. By the time the RCMP returned his call, hours later, the fear had taken root in his chest so deep it was hard to breathe. The agent this time was different, older, more serious, less patient. He asked pointed questions. "Where did you get this? Why did you leave the embassy? Are you trying to defect? Is this real? Do you have more?" Gouzenko didn't blink. He told the truth. Not all of it. Not yet, but enough. The officer took a single page from the file, one that referenced a man known in code only as H-12. In time, they would learn that this cryptic alias was attached to a real human being, a Canadian, a man whose name would trigger shockwaves in the halls of Parliament. But for now, the agent only nodded, folded the paper, and excused himself. The wait that followed was the most excruciating of Gouzenko's life. Inside the embassy, his disappearance had not gone unnoticed. Reports were exchanged in whispers. The satchel, the files, the keys, the absence. By nightfall, orders had gone out quietly, and by the early hours of the next day, a team in civilian clothing was assembling 2 blocks away. Svetlana woke him up in the dead of night. She had heard something. A metallic click, a faint knock, a creak in the hallway. Gouzenko didn't speak. He walked to the door, pressed his ear to it, and listened. Then silence. It would happen like that, wouldn't it? A silent approach. A knock meant only to test if they were inside. Then a crash, maybe a gunshot. Maybe they'd take the child. Maybe worse. He held her close that night and whispered that if anything happened, she was to grab the boy and run out the back. Don't stop. Don't look back. Don't wait for him. By dawn, the RCMP finally made up their minds. They returned, this time with a plain black car and a man in a long coat who said only one thing: "Come with us now, quietly." They didn't argue. At a safe house on the outskirts of Ottawa, Gouzenko was debriefed by someone new. A man whose name was never shared, whose questions were too precise to be random. He carried himself with a stiff posture and asked not about Gouzenko's personal motives, but about the codes, the techniques, the communication channels used inside the Soviet embassy. Gouzenko answered in kind, revealing how he had been trained to encode traffic using numeric transposition systems, how messages were disguised as innocuous diplomatic cables, and how certain phrases indicated urgency or priority. And then the moment came. He slid across the document. The sheet that showed a list of operatives, some confirmed, others suspected, inside Canada, embedded in government offices, research labs, even the military. The man reading it stopped mid-page. He said nothing. Then he stood up, walked into the hallway, and closed the door behind him. It was a turning point. The weight of truth was too heavy now to ignore. In the embassy, however, the weight of betrayal triggered something else. At 10:34 p.m., 2 men arrived at Gouzenko's apartment building. They spoke to no one. They knocked. No answer. One waited by the elevator while the other picked the lock. Inside, the apartment was dark, abandoned, but not long. They searched quickly, drawers upturned, the mattress cut open, the kitchen ransacked. They didn't find what they wanted, but they left behind no doubt. The Soviets knew, and they weren't asking questions anymore. Back at the safe house, Gouzenko sat with his head in his hands while an RCMP officer asked him to go over the same names again. One of them stood out, Fred Rose, a sitting member of parliament, connected by threads too strong to ignore. That name alone made everything too dangerous, too political, too public. The Canadians were now in possession of more than intelligence. They held a powder keg. That night, as the team quietly moved Svetlana and the baby to a separate location, the RCMP arranged for 24-hour surveillance. The house was watched, guarded. Gouzenko was told to trust no one but a handful of men, officers who would be rotated regularly, all vetted, all bound to secrecy. Even among the government, very few were briefed. The stakes were high. If the Soviets thought the Canadians were harboring a defector, retaliation could come not just through assassins, but through diplomatic warfare. But it was already too late for discretion. The mole embedded in one of Canada's civil ministries, a man later identified but never publicly named, had learned of the documents. He alerted the Soviet legation, not officially, not on paper, but in passing. A glance, a whisper, enough. And so came the raid. Had Gouzenko and his family stayed in that apartment even a few hours longer, they would have disappeared. The Soviets denied involvement. They claimed concern. They even attempted to speak directly to the Canadians about retrieving an employee who had become mentally unwell. The language was cold, calculated, but the message was unmistakable. Bring him back, or we will. By the time the Canadian Prime Minister was briefed, everything had changed. A Soviet defector in possession of files detailing a wide-ranging espionage operation wasn't just a local scandal, it was a national crisis, and perhaps worse, an international embarrassment. The Americans were informed, the British too. And suddenly the small, still capital of Ottawa became the first battlefield of a new kind of war. One fought not with tanks or planes, but with documents, secrets, and shadows. Gouzenko, sitting under the pale bulb of the safe house, saw none of that. He only saw his wife's weary eyes, his son's quiet sleep, and the documents that had become a wall between them and everything they had ever known. He didn't cry, not anymore, but his voice cracked when he asked the RCMP officer the question that had haunted him since he first walked out of the embassy gate. "Will they still come for us?" The officer didn't answer. He didn't have to. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and far across the ocean, in a dark room in Moscow, a file was opened. Inside, his name, Igor Gouzenko, marked. Dossier begun. Elimination authorized. It started with a cough outside the window. Just a cough, dry, quick, almost forgettable. But to Gouzenko, every sound now rang like a prelude to violence. He froze where he stood in the safe house kitchen, his hand hovering over a chipped porcelain cup. Svetlana, seated silently with their son on her lap, looked up and met his eyes. Neither spoke. The boy stirred, but didn't wake. Outside, the cough came again, then silence. The RCMP guards claimed they had the place secure. "No one's getting close," they said, as if barbed wire and rotating watch shifts could outmatch Moscow's memory. But the Soviets didn't need brute force. They had patience, method, time. They had people who could wait across the street for days without blinking, whose footsteps left no imprint on snow, whose eyes saw everything. The illusion of safety had been comforting at first. A warm house, a stocked pantry, a small television in the corner that occasionally flickered to life with news of a world still pretending it wasn't being rearranged in secret. But the deeper the Canadians looked into Gouzenko's documents, the more impossible it became to ignore what had been unleashed. His revelations detonated not in public, at least not yet, but behind the closed doors of intelligence agencies that had barely finished sweeping up after Hitler. The files pointed to something no one wanted to believe. Soviet agents had not only penetrated Canada's civil service and parliament, but were actively siphoning secrets from America's most guarded project, the construction of the atomic bomb. The name Los Alamos was nowhere in the documents, but the references were unmistakable. Coded instructions about uranium transport, shipment schedules aligning with those from Oak Ridge. Soviet operatives referred to only by initials, nicknames, ciphers, but some with enough detail that American and British counterintelligence teams could cross-reference and identify real people. Scientists, engineers, clerks with top-level clearance, friends. For the Americans, it was a slap in the face. The Manhattan Project had been treated as sacred, compartmentalized, locked down, invisible. And yet long before the mushroom cloud rose over Hiroshima, Stalin already knew. Canada's involvement made it worse. Chalk River, just over 150 kilometers from where Gouzenko now sat trembling in his kitchen, had been quietly supporting atomic research in coordination with the British and Americans. The files suggested that even there, Soviet eyes had infiltrated. A technician, a courier, a handler who'd passed through Ottawa once, carrying nothing but an empty briefcase that had left full. Fred Rose's name was the first that couldn't be dismissed. A sitting member of parliament, openly communist, charismatic, disarming. He had long been the subject of rumors, but never direct accusations. Gouzenko's documents didn't just suggest complicity, they detailed meetings, times, dates, people, payments. RCMP agents descended quietly on the periphery of Rose's life. Surveillance, wiretaps, a mole planted among his political allies. Then, in a decision that shattered political niceties, the government moved. Rose was arrested under the Official Secrets Act, the first Canadian politician ever charged with espionage. The news spread like wildfire, though details remained sealed. Newspapers speculated, protesters rallied outside Parliament, accusing the government of stifling dissent. But behind closed doors, the evidence was mounting. Rose wasn't just a sympathizer. He was a Soviet asset, codename Esker, and he had helped orchestrate one of the most effective information theft operations the West had ever seen. But for Gouzenko, none of this came with celebration. He watched it unfold from behind drawn curtains, unable to step outside, unable to speak to anyone but his handlers and his wife. Every crack in the floorboard sounded like a pistol being drawn. Every creak of a tree branch could have been the trigger finger of a Moscow-trained assassin. One night he woke to a strange sound, almost like breathing, slow and steady, just outside the window. He didn't move. He lay there listening, pulse hammering against his throat. A shadow crossed the far wall, but when he rushed to the curtains, nothing was there. No footprints in the snow, no guards calling out, just the wind whispering through the frostbitten limbs of an old maple tree. The next morning he asked the RCMP point blank, "Did any of your men patrol near the window last night?" They exchanged glances. "No," one finally admitted. "We've got a watch rotation. Closest they should have come was the front gate." The silence that followed was heavier than truth. Svetlana turned away, quietly pulling their son closer. The illusion was breaking. As the arrests piled up, Gouzenko's mind began to splinter under the weight of what he had done. These weren't just names on paper. They were men he had known, colleagues, sometimes friends. He remembered one especially, a translator, barely 30, with a quiet sense of humor and a weakness for English detective novels. His name was listed among the documents as having passed classified signals data from Canadian communications rooms to Moscow. When the translator was arrested weeks later, Gouzenko didn't feel triumph. He felt a deep, aching cold. "I knew his wife," he whispered to Svetlana once, not looking at her. "She made soup for us once when I had the flu. We played cards." She said nothing. What haunted him more were the children. Not just his own, but the children of the men being rounded up. Innocents. People who would grow up not knowing why their father disappeared, only that the world had turned against him. And Gouzenko had turned that wheel. But what was the alternative? To have stayed silent? To have allowed Stalin's long hand to burrow deeper into the West's bloodstream? He had made his choice, and now he was learning to live with the consequences. Across the Atlantic, British intelligence, MI5 and MI6, scrambled to verify the document's claims. Their response was swift, but secret. Several scientists with ties to wartime research were quietly reassigned or investigated. Some were dismissed, others were simply watched. One, a physicist with known communist leanings, disappeared altogether. It would be years before the West fully untangled the web Gouzenko had exposed, but already the pieces were falling into place. In Washington, the FBI worked with the Army's Counterintelligence Corps to examine overlapping files. At least 2 suspected spies named in the Gouzenko material had access to Oak Ridge and Los Alamos. Cross-checks with decrypted Soviet cables, an ultra-secret project known as Venona, began to confirm the worst. Names like Klaus Fuchs, David Greenglass, and eventually Julius and Ethel Rosenberg would later emerge. But the tip of that iceberg had begun with the quiet steps of a defector across an Ottawa street. Back in the safe house, paranoia consumed him. He started hearing voices that weren't there. He distrusted even the RCMP officers bringing him food. He would memorize their faces, then convince himself their posture had changed from one day to the next. He wondered if any of them were double agents. He once asked to search their pockets. They refused. Svetlana tried to calm him, but she too was unraveling. Their son no longer laughed. He clung to her like a second skin, eyes always scanning the corners of the room. They had been promised protection, but no one could promise peace. And then came the report. A KGB operative had been spotted near the edge of the neighborhood. The description matched a man previously assigned to Soviet operations in Montreal, a courier known to carry silenced weapons and fake identification. The RCMP acted quickly. Roadblocks, questioning. But the man vanished, gone, like smoke in the wind. When they informed Gouzenko, he didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. He only asked if they could move again. Somewhere deeper, somewhere rural, somewhere the Soviets wouldn't bother chasing ghosts. The officer didn't reply immediately. Finally, he said, "We'll see what we can do." But Gouzenko already knew. Safety was an illusion. It was a letter with no return address, no salutation, no closing signature. Just a single sheet of cheap paper, folded once, tucked inside an envelope smeared faintly with something that looked like oil. The handwriting was tight and angular, neither clearly Russian nor entirely Western. It read, "We haven't forgotten. You will." That was all. When the RCMP brought it to Gouzenko, they didn't offer much. It had arrived through a third-party postal drop. No fingerprints, no camera footage, no known suspects. He stared at the note longer than he should have, the words searing deeper the longer he held them. Svetlana sat beside him without speaking. Her hand, resting gently on his knee, trembled once, before stilling. This wasn't over. He had known it, of course. Some quiet, haunted part of him always knew. But now it had materialized in the most unmistakable way. The KGB was still watching, still waiting, and perhaps now moving. In the months that followed Fred Rose's arrest and the quiet crackdowns that rippled across North America and Britain, the impact of Gouzenko's revelations metastasized into something no one could have anticipated. What began as a single man's defection from an embassy in Ottawa bloomed into a foundational trauma of the post-war West. The Cold War hadn't begun with tanks or treaties. It had begun in whispers, in the coded fragments of a cipher clerk's memory. Within weeks, intelligence agencies from London to Washington were reshuffling their priorities. Canada established a permanent, professionalized counterintelligence apparatus, transforming what had been a loose amalgamation of wartime security forces into something more calculating, more paranoid, and more permanent. In the US, the FBI received an influx of funding and a new sense of mandate. Communism was no longer an abstract enemy. It had names, offices, neighbors. The Truman administration, rattled and scrambling, launched internal reviews of nearly every federal department. Background checks were retrofitted into political loyalty tests. Suspicion became patriotic. By 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee had returned from its wartime dormancy, rebranded and hungry. In closed-door briefings, officials cited the Ottawa incident as evidence that subversion was not merely possible, but probable, ongoing, systemic, and urgent. The anxiety metastasized into McCarthyism. Gouzenko watched it all from the shadows, seeing his warning mutate into witch hunt. Lives were ruined on accusations that lacked even the weight of his own evidence. Loyalty became performative. Careers, friendships, even marriages were severed on the suspicion of being soft on communism. And yet somehow, amid the roaring bonfire of ideological fervor, the truth of what he had uncovered began to drown beneath the noise. He had hoped the world would see, that his flight into darkness would spark clarity, that the West would respond with unity, resolve, and justice. But instead, governments began making calculations, diplomatic, political, and cold. In London, certain officials within the Foreign Office began pushing to contextualize the allegations, to avoid what they called reckless accusations that might destabilize diplomatic relations with Moscow. Publicly, the British dismissed some of the claims as exaggerated. Privately, MI5 and MI6 scrambled to vet every name and leak, their internal records showing rising panic. Files marked top secret, eyes only confirmed that several of the names in Gouzenko's documents had indeed visited British facilities under legitimate cover: scientific delegations, cultural envoys, journalists with deep pockets and vague affiliations. Some were quietly reassigned, a few vanished. One died in a supposed car accident outside Leeds, though whispers inside Vauxhall Cross hinted at a more deliberate ending. In Washington, too, the contradictions mounted. Truman, pressured by both hawks and doves in his administration, approved increased funding for the CIA, a fledgling agency still finding its feet. Yet even as he spoke about Soviet threats in public, transcripts from White House meetings revealed concerns about public overreaction and inflaming tensions unnecessarily. At least 2 prominent diplomats suspected of being compromised were quietly shielded to preserve political alliances. Their names would resurface in other scandals years later, but by then the cost of silence was already paid. Gouzenko was never told the full scope of what happened to his information. Sometimes, when his handlers arrived at the safe house with updates, they would glance away when he asked which governments were acting and which were burying. He understood. Some truths were too heavy for the daily air, but what grated at him most wasn't the silence. It was the betrayal. He had risked everything, not just his life, but the very soul of who he had been, his name, his voice, his country. And now, in the great rooms of power, some men were treating that risk like an inconvenience. Political expedience had begun to smother moral urgency. He started keeping a journal, something he hadn't done since his early training. At first, it was to track events, but over time, it became a confessional. He wrote in Russian, then English, then both. Some entries rambled for pages, others were only lines. I was someone, now I am no one. They needed the truth, I gave it, and now I am a ghost. Do ghosts feel shame for surviving? One night, months after the letter, he asked the RCMP handler who had been with him longest whether his name would ever be cleared in Russia. The man, a soft-spoken ex-military type named Carter, didn't answer. He simply said, "Would you go back if it were?" Gouzenko shook his head. Then does it matter? It did, but there was no point in arguing. Carter meant well. They all did, in their way. But they didn't understand what it meant to erase oneself, to go to sleep knowing the name on your passport, your driver's license, your mailbox wasn't yours. To teach your child a language you yourself were trying to forget. To watch your wife wear clothes she would have mocked back home, just to blend in. To hide the cadence of your vowels, to pretend your favorite food didn't exist. He had been born Igor Sergeyevich Gouzenko. Now he was someone else. The papers said George. The accent said not from here. The eyes said nothing at all. His son started school under the new name. When he brought home drawings of their family, the people were always smiling, but none of them looked like anyone Gouzenko recognized. One day, the boy asked why he couldn't tell anyone where they lived before. Gouzenko told him they had lived somewhere very cold, where people didn't like questions. The boy accepted this, but Gouzenko saw the confusion linger in his eyes. The child deserved more, but more was dangerous. When he asked if they would ever be able to speak Russian at home again, Svetlana said softly, "Only in our heads, love." Outside their house, the world barreled forward. The Berlin airlift, the formation of NATO, the Soviet explosion of their first atomic bomb, faster than any Western analyst had predicted. Every major newspaper called it a shocking breakthrough. Gouzenko read the headlines with grim clarity. It wasn't a breakthrough. It was a theft, a fulfillment of secrets whispered years ago in embassy corridors and smoke-choked safe houses. The bomb had been born in America, but baptized in espionage. The Canadian government issued quiet commendations, anonymous citations. He was granted a stipend, an arrangement called ongoing support for confidential persons of interest. But there were no medals, no plaques, no interviews. He was both too valuable and too inconvenient, a man who knew too much to be free, but not enough to be public. Years passed, and sometimes he would see his own ghost flicker through public discourse. Journalists would reference the Ottawa defector. Academics would analyze the incident that sparked Cold War paranoia. Some got the dates wrong, others misspelled his name. One report referred to him only as Mohan, a cipher clerk with emotional instability. He laughed bitterly. Once, while buying groceries under his alias, he overheard two men in line discussing a documentary on Soviet spies. One said, "That guy in Canada started the whole mess, didn't he?" The other replied, "He just wanted attention. Probably made half of it up." Gouzenko left the groceries behind and walked home in silence. The letter hadn't come again, but the silence that followed it was its own kind of violence. The waiting, the imagining. Every knock at the door sent his pulse racing. Every wrong number on the phone. Once, a child's ball rolled into their yard, and he nearly shouted. Paranoia had become the wallpaper of his life. Not constant panic, just the low, permanent thrum of danger, like a heartbeat he couldn't unhear. At night, he would lie awake and wonder what would happen if someone found him. Not a hitman, not a professional, just someone who remembered. Someone who had lost a father or brother or friend to an arrest years ago and still held a quiet, undying grudge. Would they spit? Would they shoot? Would they ask him why? He didn't know what he would say. He thought often of the day he left the embassy, coat zipped up too tight, documents hidden in his arms like contraband scripture. He thought of the split second when he stepped onto Canadian soil, when he became not a man, but an idea, betrayer to some, prophet to others. That moment had stretched into a life of shadows, a life with no clean endings. The RCMP informed him that the investigation into the letter had gone cold. No new leads, no follow-ups, possibly a hoax, possibly not. But they were watching things closely. He nodded. Of course they were. Just as the KGB was. Just as he was watching, always watching. He went home that day and wrote one final line in his journal. The danger wasn't over. It never would be. He never let his son play near windows. Even when the sun painted the grass gold and the wind carried the laughter of other children, like the echo of a world they used to belong to, Igor Gouzenko kept the curtains drawn and the doors locked. The locks were never enough. Not when you believed that a man who could kill you with a knitting needle might already be inside your home. Not when your own face had been erased from the world because it had become too dangerous to exist. The world now knew of Stalin's spies, thanks to him. But knowing came with a cost. It always had. Gouzenko didn't just steal Soviet secrets. He stole time from himself, the right to exist openly, the ordinary privileges of being a father, a man, a name in public. In return, he gained only shadows and silence. After the headlines faded and the courtrooms emptied, there was no applause waiting for him, no parades or thank you letters. There was only a safe house with no address, a city that forgot he lived in it, and a name that changed with every move. He'd been relocated again, this time to a small town on the outskirts of Ontario, where the only noise at night was the hollow sound of wind dragging itself through pine trees. The RCMP kept their word. They provided security. But security was relative. It didn't cure paranoia. It didn't ease Svetlana's sobs when a phone rang and no one spoke on the other end. It didn't stop the stranger who followed them one afternoon in the grocery store, his coat too thick for summer, his eyes too slow to blink. There had been a letter once, folded neatly and dropped in their mailbox without a stamp. The writing was in perfect Cyrillic. You are not forgotten. That was all it said. No signature, no mistake. The silence in the house afterward stretched for hours, until even the children whispered. Every few months he testified in court, always in disguise. He gave evidence that destroyed lives. Some of those he named were men he'd worked beside for years. One had once given him a birthday gift. Another had comforted him when his first child fell ill. Now, behind bulletproof glass, he told the truth about them, about the meetings, the stolen blueprints, the encrypted names buried in ciphers. His expertise in Soviet codes gave Western intelligence the master key. And each time he spoke, each time he helped send someone to prison or political ruin, he felt the weight of it. Not guilt, exactly, not regret, but something heavier. The realization that a piece of his old life died with every man he exposed. The KGB hadn't forgotten him. He knew it. RCMP officers confirmed it once, their tone too calm to be comforting. Soviet defectors whispered of bounties, of names scribbled on target lists passed between handlers like cursed parchment. Gouzenko's was always near the top. He wasn't just a traitor to the USSR, he was a precedent, a wound that never stopped bleeding. If they could silence him, they might prevent the next man from speaking. That made him dangerous in a way bullets couldn't erase. So they sent shadows after him. Not officially, not with brass badges and embassies. They sent illegals, men and women trained to blend into the West without a trace, sleeping like viruses in host bodies, waiting for orders, waiting for names. They posed as teachers, milkmen, tailors. And when the time came, they didn't need weapons louder than a whisper. Once, while walking alone to the post office, Gouzenko spotted a man across the street. He recognized the gait, the way he held his briefcase too tightly, like it was more important than his heartbeat. The same man had been behind him days before, inside a drugstore, pretending to browse. That day, Gouzenko didn't go inside the post office. He went home. And the man disappeared, but the fear didn't. He told no one, not even Svetlana. Paranoia had become a form of protection. Svetlana had changed. The once warm, smiling woman who used to hum lullabies while hanging laundry now spoke with a distant rhythm, like her thoughts were always elsewhere. She'd lost family in the war, friends to the purges, and now the possibility of ordinary life to her husband's decisions. Sometimes she said nothing for hours, just sat by the radio and turned the dial endlessly, as if searching for a frequency that could take her back in time. One night, after putting the children to bed, she said softly, "Do you think we'll ever laugh without checking the windows first?" He didn't answer, because laughter, like sunlight, felt dangerous now. He still wrote, pages and pages, not for publication. No one could publish a man who didn't officially exist, but for himself. He wrote about the men who'd betrayed their countries for ideology, for greed, or because someone had whispered the right words in the right ears. He wrote about his dreams, which had become stranger, full of echoing footsteps and locked doors, of voices behind walls that never spoke clearly. Once, he dreamt that his children were speaking fluent Russian to a man without a face. He woke up in a cold sweat. The next day, he asked the RCMP to install another deadbolt on the back door. His children adapted more quickly. They were young. Names were just sounds to them. A new school meant a new story. Their father was an accountant, a translator, someone who worked for the government. They learned to lie without knowing they were lying, but the cost was visible in their drawings. Houses with no windows, people with eyes but no mouths. Occasionally, other defectors came to Canada. He heard about them through indirect channels: a Soviet pilot, a scientist, a KGB technician. Some made it out, others didn't. Each time he wondered what made him different, why he'd survived. The answer he feared was chance. Not skill, not planning, just timing. A superior too slow, a knock delayed, a newspaper editor too curious. He didn't like thinking that his life rested on coincidence. It made the fear feel arbitrary. It made survival feel borrowed. The trials continued. The world outside turned colder, metaphorically and literally. McCarthyism rose like a fever across the border. In Britain, secrets unraveled and men vanished. In the US, the Rosenbergs were executed. Everywhere, trust became currency, and no one had enough. Gouzenko watched it all from behind locked doors, his name never mentioned, his voice unheard. But he saw his shadow on every page, every headline. Not literally, but he felt it. The tremor he'd set off was now an earthquake shaping policy, paranoia, and power struggles. And still, he couldn't step outside without checking twice. They moved again. A new identity, a smaller town, more anonymity. The children were older now. One asked why they didn't have baby pictures. Another asked why no relatives ever visited. Svetlana told them it was complicated. That was the truth. As true as anything they were allowed to say. Years passed, not in silence, but in the kind of noise that erodes you slowly. Footsteps, key turns, the creak of mail slots at night. Once, he received a package with no return address. Inside was a single glove. He burned it without telling anyone. Later, he stared at the ashes and wondered, was it just a mistake? Or had someone been that close? He gave one interview. One. Masked, his voice distorted, his name changed again. It aired late at night, buried between less frightening stories. But those who listened, those who understood what he'd done, what it had cost him, they knew. They heard the tremble beneath his sentences. Not fear, something worse. Fatigue. Still, some part of him refused to die. He planted a garden. Tomatoes, mostly. Svetlana said it made him look normal. That was the point. Every morning he walked outside, gloves on, hat low, and watered the plants like the world wasn't hunting him. And each time he stooped down, hands in the earth, he imagined a different life. One where he was just a man who loved his family, who never learned to read ciphers or smuggle secrets, who never saw what his government was doing in the shadows. But those thoughts passed like clouds, and reality always returned. It came back again one evening when he went out to buy bread. The shopkeeper was new, young, smiling too much, his Russian accent too subtle to notice unless you were trained to listen. He handed Gouzenko his change and said, "You've aged well," then smiled, a second too long. Gouzenko nodded, left, and never went back. The RCMP swept the town a week later. No trace of the man, just an empty apartment with newspapers from Moscow folded neatly on the table. He started sleeping with a chair wedged under the door again. Svetlana said nothing. She just moved her pillow closer to the wall. One night, while the wind howled against the windows and a storm blackened the sky, his son, now nearly grown, asked him plainly, "Was it worth it?" Gouzenko sat still for a long time, then said, "Ask me when you're a father." The boy nodded, then asked no more. That was the thing about truth. It didn't make you feel brave. It made you feel exposed. He had told the truth, and in return, Mipin. He became a ghost. But even ghosts can haunt nations. His testimony had shaken empires. His defection had realigned borders, changed how intelligence worked, how secrets were kept, how trust was measured. Yet here he was, unknown, unthanked, unresolved. And then, one day, walking near the edge of town, past the fence line of a half-frozen field, he saw a man watching from across the road. He looked ordinary. That was the worst kind. Too ordinary. The man didn't move, didn't smile, didn't turn away, just stared. Gouzenko walked faster. He never looked back. But that night, the question burned in his mind like fire through dry leaves. Had they found him? Would he ever be safe? The curtains stayed closed that week. The doors locked tighter. The chair wedged harder. But even that couldn't keep out the memory of those eyes, calm, still, waiting. Because some dangers don't knock. They wait, patient, silent. And Gouzenko knew the silence was always louder before the storm. How many others like him remain hidden in history? Men with names erased, truths too dangerous to speak aloud, memories classified not by ink or secrecy, but by necessity, buried for the sake of nations that will never know what they owe. Igor Gouzenko's story does not end with applause. It ends with silence. But not emptiness, not insignificance. His silence is the echo that shaped an entire era, the tremor that changed how the world understood danger, not as something that marched in uniform, but as something that whispered in fluent English behind a neighbor's door. Long after the spotlights faded, long after the last courtroom fell quiet, and even as the Cold War machinery thundered into new generations, his name remained a cipher, a man who vanished into the very intelligence labyrinth he helped expose. And yet, the world he left behind would never again be the same. Before Gouzenko, the West had hoped. After him, it watched. Before him, secrets were the weapons of war. After him, suspicion became the armor of peace. It was in the slow grind of bureaucracy that his revelations bore their sharpest teeth. Departments once blind to foreign subterfuge suddenly grew new eyes. Files once gathering dust were now combed for codes, affiliations, inconsistencies. Politicians who once dismissed espionage as a relic of fiction now demanded loyalty oaths and background checks. Intelligence agencies were reborn not out of ideology, but out of necessity. The FBI didn't just listen more, they listened better. MI5 restructured. The RCMP security service gained new directives. And within NATO's earliest blueprints, there were quiet acknowledgments, faint outlines of what Gouzenko had proven, that espionage was not a sideshow, but the main stage. The names he provided triggered a chain reaction that collapsed entire networks. Every name, every confession confirmed under oath, became a falling domino. Taking down handlers, couriers, sources embedded deep in Western institutions. Diplomats, scientists, engineers, soldiers. It wasn't just a question of who had passed secrets. It became who still might. The purges were surgical, quiet, often invisible to the public. But the intelligence world knew. A ghost had walked into their offices carrying a briefcase, and what he'd left behind would haunt policies for decades. And yet, amid the geopolitical shifts and intelligence reforms, the most profound legacy was not institutional. It was human. A man had chosen truth over comfort, safety, even identity. Not because he would be rewarded, but because he believed silence was a betrayal larger than fear. He had not acted out of vengeance. He had not defected for fame. He'd simply reached a point where complicity became unbearable. And in that single act, when he stepped out into a Canadian newsroom and laid bare the skeleton of Stalin's Western Reach, he rewrote the cost of courage. Courage, in Gouzenko's case, was not a dramatic confrontation or a climactic gunfight. It was quieter, more enduring. It was raising children who never knew their real last name. It was looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life. It was burying a language you once loved because it had become the sound of danger. It was building a future on top of a demolished past. Years passed. New wars came. The Berlin Wall rose and fell. Files were declassified. Agents aged. But Gouzenko remained an absence where there should have been a monument. His story flickered through archives, in testimonies, in heavily redacted intelligence documents. but his face was rarely seen, his voice almost never heard. He became a symbol not of glory, but of quiet resistance, of what it meant to do the right thing and live with what that required. He died in 1982. Few noticed. His obituary, like his life, was modest, tucked away from spectacle. The world had moved on. The Cold War was still grinding forward, heavier than ever. Satellites replaced informants, nukes replaced briefcases. But the architecture of distrust, the very scaffolding of intelligence parity, was built on what he revealed. The Soviet threat was not speculative. It was rooted, networked, breathing inside democracies. He proved it, and once proven, it could no longer be denied. Canada never revealed his exact burial place. His grave, like his life, remains anonymous. Not because he wasn't worthy of remembrance, but because some truths, even in death, still require protection. Svetlana outlived him by a few quiet years, raising children who became strangers to the language of their birth. The children grew up Canadian, free, but aware, always, that their freedom was paid for with shadows. And even now, long after the Cold War's embers have dimmed, intelligence agencies still train their new recruits on case studies born of his legacy. His defection is taught not as a dramatic moment, but as a fracture, one that revealed the rot inside Western optimism. Before him, security was a matter of border patrols and treaties. After him, it was an unending vigilance of minds, of institutions, of whispers in the halls of government. His briefcase, the one he carried out of the Soviet embassy, filled with the nation's secrets, is preserved in a museum, not as a relic, but as a quiet warning, a symbol of how fragile truth can be, and how powerful. But the question remains, heavier now than ever. How many others like Gouzenko remain hidden? How many walked away from silence, buried their pasts, and quietly reshaped history? How many live among us with names not their own, haunted by the same decision, to tell the truth when the world would rather not hear it? His story is not a footnote. It is a fault line. A human story of defiance, not told through loud heroics, but through the enduring weight of isolation, sacrifice, and the refusal to let fear dictate morality. Sometimes, when the wind swept just right across the trees behind his last home, neighbors said they could see a man in the window, always behind the curtains, watching, not paranoid, just prepared, as if he knew that the price of truth wasn't paid once, it was paid every day after. And perhaps that's the lesson he leaves behind, not just for intelligence officers or historians or world leaders, but for all of us. That truth, when spoken against power, doesn't make life easier. It makes it lonelier, but necessary. He never returned to Russia, not even in thought. That country no longer existed, not the one he'd loved, not the one he'd feared. What remained was a scar, a memory etched into the structure of the modern world. Igor Gouzenko didn't end the Cold War, but he cracked it open. And in doing so, he reminded us that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a lie. It's a man who tells the truth and survives. If you've come this far, you now know what most people don't. You've seen how a single man's choice detonated illusions that stretched across continents. But this is only one part of the greater shadow war that defined the 20th century. There are others who ran through the same silent corridors, others who were never found, others who are still waiting to be understood. So if you want to know how espionage shaped the borders of our modern world, not with tanks or treaties, but with secrets, betrayals, and names you've never heard, then join us. Subscribe and uncover the stories history tried to forget, because sometimes the loudest parts of history were whispered.